Miguel, ¿estás?
Sí.
Sí, cuando quieras, cuando quieras.
¿Puedo empezar ya?
Sí, sí, sí. Tenemos
Ah,
aquí 4 personas, tenemos en Zoom otras 4, pues ya empezamos, sí.
okay. So Jose Luis and I have been speaking in Spanish, but he says that it's better for me to speak in English, and I'm quite happy to do this. But as we professors know, we professors of Spanish know, we're always in something of a schizophrenic mode with the language, speaking in English and in Spanish, especially in our own Spanish literature classes. But I'm comfortable with both languages, especially when I'm talking about one of my favorite poets of all time, Federico Garcia Lorca, and that's what we're here to do. But maybe first, just a little bit about myself. I'm Michael Ugarte, and that's how I was baptized, but my mother and father called me Miguel. And both my parents were from Spain. My dad came to the United States just after World War II. He supported the anti-Franco forces, but decided to stay in Spain to see that perhaps after World War II, the question of Spain would open up. That didn't happen. So my father was something of both an immigrant to the United States, and immigrants leave their country for economic reasons, but he's also an exile because he was not happy with the present government. And my mother followed him. He was lucky. He was very fortunate and well educated, so that he spoke English well. My mother, on the other hand, spoke not a word of English, and the place where they ended up, which is New Hampshire, of all places, was very, very difficult for them. So I grew up speaking Spanish. As a matter of fact, Spanish was my first language. But then, of course, with grade school and the very few people speaking Spanish in New Hampshire, I gradually was not only adapted English, but that was the language that I was speaking. And I was typical of an immigrant in that my mom and dad would speak to me in Spanish and I would answer in English. And my dad would pretend, Miguel, yo no entiendo. I don't understand what you're saying. And so I go, come on, Dad, you understand, and all that. So another thing I wanted to tell you about me is that in retirement, I've been retired for several years, and I've been involved with a course that you might be interested in. As I understand, this is partially organized by the Democratic Socialists at the university. We have a cross-listed course with the main department sponsoring it is Peace Studies, and it's called Authoritarianism and Democracy. And we approach it from a variety of approaches. I say we because it's a team-taught course. There are 4, sometimes 5 professors dealing with various aspects of democracy and authoritarianism. And its genesis was just after the election of our former president, that I'm not even going to name. But that's where the inspiration of that course is. And the section that I teach happens to be about what I'm talking about now, not just about Lorca, but in a much broader sense, the historical memory of Spain, the historical memory of the Spanish Civil War. And the difference between simply the history of the Spanish Civil War and the historical memory of the Spanish Civil War is that with memory, It's the recording of the war, what was learned about that war and what the country perceives to be the reality of that certain event that virtually changed everything in Spain from 1939 right on through to the death of Francisco Franco in 1979. So that's the way I'm going to approach my my modest talk on Federico Garcia Lorca, and please understand that I'm really scratching the surface of this event, because this poet and this poet's life is tremendously complex, and with my brief explanation of it, you're just going to get the beginnings of it. It's my hope that you do some research about not only about Lorca, but about the Spanish Civil War. So Federico Garcia Lorca was born in the province, or in a rural town of Granada, which is a very important city in the south of Spain, in Fuente Vaqueros. And his upbringing was rural. He was of a family that had property. He was relatively well-to-do. His mother was a big influence on him, something of a domineering woman, not quite as domineering as one of his most well-known characters of his play La Casa de Bernarda Alba. That some of you may be familiar with. If not, I'll go into it later on. But he was clearly influenced by the dominance of the Catholic Church and its intellectual dominance, its hegemonic dominance throughout all of Spain, throughout all of Spanish history. On the other hand, he was enamored by his town. He says it in the autobiographical writings of Lorca, is he liked the atmosphere in terms of its closeness, its familiarity, the fact that he would go out into the fields and people would know him as the son of one of the owners. He has sort of an idyllic memory of his own Granada. He was very much of a rural person and not an urban person, although due to his familiarity and due to his talent as a poet, of course, he spent times in many cities, Madrid being the main one, but also in Paris, and especially in New York. And I'm going to talk about his stay in New York later on. So after that relatively happy childhood, there's one thing about Lorca that has to be underlined by anyone who studies him and anyone who reads him, and that is his otherness, his difference. He feels from the very beginning of his life, even though he was well integrated into his small town, he felt other. He always had an inkling for those people who were ostracized from society. That's from the very beginnings of his life, and that's reflected in virtually all of his poetry. And the other important aspect of his life that really we haven't grappled with until, say, the later 20th century is that Federico Garcia Lorca was gay. He was a homosexual, at times open about it, at times not so open about it, and that very much adds to his difference as a poet. In terms of literary history, he was part of the movement of the 20s called the Vanguardistas, or the so-called generation of 1927. And it was mainly a generation of poets, although Lorca was very much of a prose writer as well, and especially a writer of both tragedies and comedies and in drama. But this group of writers consisted of one of the most stellar group of writers in Spanish literature and poetry, people like Rafael Alberti, Pedro Salinas, Luis Cernuda, who was also gay, openly so, perhaps even more openly so than Cernuda, Nobel Prize winning poet in 1977, Vicente Aleixandre, who isn't well known, but many people believe he was given the Nobel Prize as sort of a gesture toward Spain achieving a democracy after years of oppression by Franco, and also as a gesture to the remarkable group of poets that he belonged to. Relatively few women in this group, but there are few, in particular, Maria Zambrano, who is a philosopher, a very important philosopher who collaborated with one of Spain's most important philosophers, José Ortega y Gasset, that I'm going to talk about later. Maria Teresa León, a writer, a prose writer, and the wife of Rafael Alberti. Many of these people changed their poetic sensibilities from what they were writing in the 20s to what happened to them when the Second Spanish Republic was declared. In the 1920s, they were interested in new forms of art. Whatever was new was almost by definition good. So they were vanguardists. They believed in Hermeticism, which is a type of poetry that's difficult for average people to understand. And the further that one gets away from obvious interpretations, the better it is for that poet. They were looking for new expressions that were far from easy representation. Abstraction. Think of all the painters of this area, including Pablo Picasso and Salvador Dalí, both of whom knew Lorca very well and participated in this movement. One of the important works of philosophy of this period is called La deshumanización del arte, or the dehumanization of art, by José Ortega y Gasset. And one of these things, among many others, it's an important work, and I recommend it highly, although it's very problematic in terms of its conceptual, its themes of what it's trying to put forth. But it's important to know what Ortega y Gasset was saying about art at this time. He was one of the proponents of art for art's sake. And perhaps in your English classes, you've heard that term before. And it has to do with art, even just on its own terms, that art doesn't have to mean anything. It simply is an expression of sensations and emotions. Any given one meaning to a poem is not what the entire work of art is supposed to be. There should be many reasons, many meanings of a poem that can go in many different directions. Word plays, sometimes absurdity, sometimes things that have no representation in reality. And when you think of, and I hope that most of you know, the painting of Salvador Dalí, the early Salvador Dalí, And of course, Pablo Picasso, the inventor of Cubism, who was anti-representational. And that's what Ortega means by dehumanization. It's not that it was anti-human, it's that it was anti-representation. And he made a statement in this work that many people have criticized, including myself, but we need to take it on at face value. And that is that this new art is an art for artists. It's not an art for the common people. We're trying to achieve an expression that goes beyond obvious meanings. And what we need to do is interrogate those meanings in every way that we can. So for a person who likes poetry in and of itself, who was educated in Romanticism, for example, is going to find this kind of poetry difficult because at times the representations that it's trying to put forth are not obvious. As a matter of fact, the less obvious, the better. The reader has to look for his or her own meanings in the work of art. Think also of the films of Luis Buñuel, especially his early works, one in particular called The Andalusian Dog, El Perro Andaluz, who, by the way, the protagonist of that film, which if you watch it for the first time, I'm sure it's on Netflix, I'm sure it's easily accessible, but the 20 minutes of this film, you won't have a damn idea of what the whole thing means. But that's what it's about. It's about representations in art, cause and effect. It's more of a philosophical statement on what art is. And there was something else about that film that we later found out as critics, and because Buñuel was honest about it, that it was a reference to Lorca himself in not necessarily a positive light. It was something of a mockery of Lorca, and I'll tell you why. Because Lorca had just written something called the Gypsy Ballads, El Romancero Gitano, which was to those people, the people who were interested in this Hermetic art, way too representational. But it was one of Lorca's most lasting works, and it's one of my favorites as well. It's the Gypsy Ballads. It's about gypsies, their lives in Spain, the way they're ostracized, and often about love relationships. They're often works of fantasy that aren't easily capturable. When I teach El Romancero Gitano to my students, many of them, the first reading is what's going on here? And the important thing to realize about these ballads is that they're just that, ballads, romances. They tell a story. But what happens in the story, it's not eminently clear. And the reason that I'm going to call them highfalutin poets and artists like Buñuel didn't like this work is they felt that it was too stereotypical, too representational, too easy to make an association between these gypsies and Spanish culture. Let me just give you one example of a very famous one. It's about the moon. And one of the verses goes like this. The moon, la luna vino a la fragua con su polizón de nardos. It sounds so much better in Spanish. And it's my attempt at translation. The moon came down to the forge with a bustle of flowers, and the boy looks and looks at her, and the boy is looking at her. And the moon says, "Get out of here." First, no, and the boy says to the moon, there's a dialogue between the moon and the boy says, "Get out of here, moon, get out, because if the gypsies come, they'll take your heart and turn it into silver necklaces and white rings. Be careful, moon, because you're in danger that the gypsies are going to come and capture you." And at the end of the poem, what do we see? But just the opposite. The moon captures the boy, and the last image is of the moon riding through the night with a little boy behind her. So what does all this actually mean? It's about sensations. It's about emotions. It's about a child's sensibilities. But of course, to these poets that were searching for Hermeticism, it was too obvious to them. And Buñuel in particular criticized Lorca for having written these gypsy ballads. Lorca was devastated by this. An important part of Lorca, in addition to his homosexuality, is that we would call him today a victim of depression, if not bipolar. He was constantly suffering from depressions, from his own experience, from bad memories that he had. And so many of his poems reflect that in death and in ostracism, his inability to feel a oneness with the world. And here's what maybe the most important part of his depression is his lack of ability to achieve long-lasting love. And by love, I mean romantic love, which to a heterosexual is with someone of the opposite sex. But for Lorca, it was the love of a man. And there were several men in Lorca's life. And we can all attest to our understanding of that era, but being a homosexual in the 1920s in Spain was not easy. Although perhaps it was easier to those people who were participating in the so-called Roaring Twenties. Remember that this is the period of people like Virginia Woolf and all those British poets that created so many lasting works. So we're talking in 1929 now. Lorca's so devastated by this because it seems that Buñuel was making fun of his love relationship with a man, although that's not at all clear in the film. But that's how Lorca took it when he saw the film. He saw the film as a mockery of not only his poetry, but of himself, of a man rejected not only by society, but by the very people who purported to be his supporters in poetry and in his poetic movement. So he goes to New York. It's sort of a self-imposed exile in New York. And a lot has been said about his stay in New York. It was relatively short. It was a little over a year, but it was among the worst periods of his life. And you can see that in the poetry itself. I recommend it highly. It's a volume of poetry. It's very difficult to understand, but don't worry about it because that's the point of it. It's autobiographical, but he establishes a series of meanings that are meaningful only to himself as a boy. For example, a pot, a broom that he looked at that turns into something archetypical or something that's even difficult to understand exactly what it is. Here's just one passage of Poet in New York, just showing how much he detested New York, not its intellectual vibrance, but what he detested about it was its grayness, its lack of heart, its impersonality, the great cosmopolitan city that could care less about human beings. And this, go back to what I said about Lorca as being the product of a small town in Andalusia, nonetheless, where if there's anything that is characteristic of a small town in Andalusia, it's the love and the interaction that people have among themselves. And in New York, Lorca found none of this. As a matter of fact, he found just the opposite. He was a no one in New York, although he was a relatively well-known poet, but he felt ostracized. He felt not himself. And this was an object of a great deal of suffering for him. And luckily for him, he was able to express that suffering in his poetry. One of these poems reads, it's called Vuelta de Paseo, back from a walk in the streets of New York. And he starts it out by murdered by the sky, asesinado por el cielo, murdered by the sky between the winding forms like snakes and forms looking for crystal. I shall let my hair down, stumbling with my new face every day. And it goes on in that way of evoking that sorrow, that impersonality, that dehumanization of the great city of New York. And he ends with the very way that he began the poem, but this time with exclamation points: murdered by the sky. Another really important part of that poem, again, I suggest that all of you take a look at it. You're not going to understand a lot of it, but every now and then you'll read parts of it that make a lot of sense. Lorca was fascinated by Black culture, by African-American culture. And he has one part of the poem that's called The King of Harlem. And he makes allusions to the music that he heard in Harlem. And there's something that I just failed to say about, but I need to at least mention it in passing. Lorca was a poet, but he was also a musician. He was a lover of Beethoven, and he played the piano so well that it was a question to him and his family in what direction he should go in terms of his art, music or poetry. And I would answer that question to say that he went for both, really, because you can hear the music in Lorca's poetry. And when he was in Harlem, that's what he heard. He heard beats. He heard feet pounding on the pavement, and he turned it into something rhythmical, but something very expressive of people who are oppressed. And it says so in this this passage that I'm quoting here. Ay, Harlem, no hay angustia comparable con tus rojos oprimidos a tu sangre estremecida dentro del eclipse oscuro, a tu violencia granate sordomuda en la penumbra, a tu gran rey prisionero, el rey de Harlem, con un traje de conserje. is a he talks about tu sangre estremecida, the thin blood within a dark eclipse. Images of blackness resonate throughout this passage. And there's also depictions of gay life in Poeta en Nueva York. One of Lorca's favorite poets was none other than the famous American poet Walt Whitman, whom most people know by now was also gay, despite that resounding male celebration of, I'm not sure if it's male, but it's certainly resounding and strong, perhaps virile celebration of American culture and America in all its natural beauty. Lorca was known as a surrealist, and many of those gypsy ballads and many of his poems are surreal. And by surreal, if those of you who studied English know that it's an attempt to capture a realism that goes beyond what's immediately present to one in your senses, in what you see and what you hear and what you smell. It's a surrealism that explores the mind, and it explores the mind's interpretation of that realism. It's interested in dreams, for example. It's interested in fantasies. And as you can see in Poet in New York, he has a highly personalized and autobiographical references, sometimes to memories, dreams of things that happened to him in the past that only mean something specific to him. Who knows what they could mean to a reader? And Lorca was the first to say, when asked, what do your poems mean? He would answer, what do they mean to you? You're the one who has to search for the meanings. They're extremely heretic. That means that they're not easily accessible to most people. And the Poeta en Nueva York is one of his most elusive poems. Okay, I haven't even mentioned the Spanish Civil War yet. I haven't mentioned politics at all, but look what happens in just a few years after his return back to Spain. In 1931, the proclamation of the Spanish Second Republic is promoted, and it wins elections, and it abolishes a monarchy that had been part of Spanish life for centuries, from the Habsburgs to the Bourbons. And it's important to underline that word republic, which is different. It is not exactly democracy, although they're democratic republics, but a republic to Lorca and to many of those who supported it, including my father, was that they wanted to abolish the monarchy. There's talk of this, that the English haven't abolished it yet. There is talk about abolishing it. There are very, very few monarchies left. But in Spain in the 1930s, many people were fed up with a monarchy and everything that came with a monarchy, including aristocracy and aristocratic oppression. It was a major event that changed virtually everything in Spain. The abolition of the monarchy to a democratic constitutional republic that legalized virtually all political parties and ideologies. So what happened as a result of that? What happened from 1931 to 1936, which is when the Civil War begins? What happened is that all of these leftist ideologies got new vigor. And by the leftist ideologies, I mean socialism, communism, anarchism, anarcho-syndicalism, those people who wanted to go beyond a republic and create a socialist government in Spain. But look at those, all those isms that I've mentioned here in my notes. From liberalism to communism to socialism, anarchism, anarcho-syndicalism, they're very different. And what happened on the left side of the Spanish Civil War was they all started fighting among themselves. There were workers' rebellions in virtually every part of Spain, so much so that in Asturias, there was almost a communist revolution that took over the entire province until the Republican government sent troops to quell that rebellion. What did that create? That created a great deal of animosity on the part of those people who wanted to create that new Spain, that new revolutionary Spain. And on the right, we have monarchists, people who wanted to conserve monarchism. Some of them were very right-wing monarchists, others not so right-wing. They wanted to have a constitutional monarchy, a democracy, but never abolish the monarchy, because that means you abolish Spanish identity. The king is always associated. Today, Spain is a monarchy. And why do people want to keep it? Not all, but I think more people want to keep it than want to abolish it. Why do they want to keep it? Because it's part of Spanish identity. It's our king. We need him for the same reason that the Brits want to keep their just the other day, King Charles III is now the official King of England. But what also was on the right, and this is very important, also, of course, there was a conservatism, sort of a law and order government, but much more important was that we have full-fledged authoritarianism and fascism, because for those of you historians, you know what was happening in the 1930s in the rest of Europe. There was a rising fascist movement, and there were two strongmen figures who were on the verge of dominating all of Europe. And that was especially Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, who were growing in popularity and especially in strength, in military strength. What is the nature of these nationalist, these movements toward authoritarianism? And you might boil it down, and pardon me for simplifying it, but you could boil it down to one word, and that is nationalism, and nationalism with a capital N. A kind of nationalism that proclaims that our nation is entitled to far more of the territory that it's been apportioned by national governments and international contracts. Therefore, we have Adolf Hitler wanting to expand Germany, first Austria, then Poland, then what are today the satellite, the formerly satellite states of Russia. Mussolini felt that he wanted to bring back the Roman Empire. Imperialism is an important part of this ideology, and it seems so far-fetched to us today, although maybe not so far-fetched considering what's happening as we speak in the United States. For those who believed in this, they believed more than anything in their country. My country, right or wrong. And if you don't like it, leave. And as a matter of fact, if you might express ideas that are anti-nationalism, we have a constitution that's written up by an oligarchy that can put you in jail, and not only put you in jail, perhaps even sentence you to death. And I'm not exaggerating, because that's what was happening in Spain after Franco won the war, won the Civil War. So as I said, there's a lot of worker unrest. This is important too. There are two important movements, powerless people without power, ostracized people in Spain, and that is a growing working class, especially in the cities, mainly Barcelona, but in other cities as well, the miners of Asturias, and the other people who are rising up, mostly revolutionaries, were peasants. Peasant uprisings throughout Andalusia, Extremadura, and many parts of rural Spain. And why were they fighting? Why? Why did they want a revolution? It was because they had been oppressed, because they were subject to infirmity, to poverty, to hunger. They wanted to combat the economic system of latifundia, a system that unfortunately much of Latin America inherited from the Spanish, that is the oligarchical control of vast territories of land in which you almost enslave people or make people work for almost zero wages and without any real benefits to them, no possibilities of upward mobility, oppression in all the sense of the word. Caciquismo is another important reality that these workers were rebelling against, and caciquismo is the one-man rule, and this is not only a one-man rule of the entire country, but it could be the one-man rule of a small town. The mayor, who literally tells everybody what to do and when, and is simply not working, but taking in rent that the peasants are paying to him, so that he allows them to work the land. Peasant farmers, sharecropping. There are a lot of similarities between what Black people suffered in the South and Spanish peasants in Spain. So in 1936, Francisco Franco and a group of right-wing fascist generals organized an insurrection to topple the duly and democratically elected Republican government. Sometimes we forget this, that it seems as though the left wing was the rebellion, were the people in rebellion, but no, it was the right wing who rebelled against a government that was already in place. That war lasted for only 3 years, and the Spanish Republic lost for a great deal, for many reasons, complex reasons. I'll summarize just a few, and forgive me for the simplification. One reason is that the Spanish left could not get together. There was too much infighting within the left. And the other reason is that the Allied powers, those supposedly democratic governments like the United States, France, England, did not support the Spanish Republic. They declared themselves neutral. Hitler and Mussolini also declared themselves neutral, but they didn't abide by the agreement. They sent troops. They did everything in their power for Franco and his generals to win, so that they thought that maybe they would have their man in Spain. Spain is very geographically well suited for military reasons. It's right on in the Mediterranean with openings to the Atlantic. It's very desired land for anyone who wants to dominate, to have geopolitical domination. So the question is then, given everything that's happening here, how did Lorca respond to it? And how did his fellow generation of 1927 writers respond? And it's not a complex answer to that. Also, it has all sorts of different repercussions, but they questioned what they were writing before. They turned into political beings. They became interested in politics, and they said they agreed very much with the so-called Frente Popular, the Popular Front, which was an ideology that all the left said that they adhered to, and that is, we don't have the luxury to fight amongst themselves. We have impending fascism to fight against. And many of these people who were very elitist poets in the 1920s turned into unquestionable supporters of the Republic. And I'm talking especially about Rafael Alberti, so many others, Machado, who was Antonio Machado, one of the most well-known poets of Spain at this time, and many others turned themselves into militants in favor of the Spanish Republic. Lorca was one of these. For many of them, their writing turned into politically committed writing in favor of the Republic, in favor of socialism, such as Machado's work. A man whom I have not mentioned now is very much part of this, but he was not Spanish, he was Chilean, and that's none other than Pablo Neruda. Pablo Neruda knew all of these people. He spent lots of time in Spain, and he was absolutely incensed, indignant by what these right-wing generals had done. So Lorca's response to this was not so much in his writing, it was in his activism. He created a group, it's not only his creation, but several university students at this time created a group called La Barraca. And I've got I think Jose Luis's poster for this talk had there they are. There's La Barraca. La Barraca was a group of students, youngsters, all in support of the Republic. Now, by the way, this was before the Civil War, right? This was allowed when the Civil War came. This would not have been allowed to go on. But this was a group of youngsters who would go from town to town, staging theater for everyone in the public plaza. And many of their works had to do with new adaptations of the great works of Spanish literature, such as the tragedies of Calderón, of Tirso, and sometimes some new suits, new skits, all of which had to do with some sort of satire against the public, against the mayor, against the oligarchs, against the landowners. And here you see just one of those right in the public square. Look at all the people would come to see this, and the purpose of it was consciousness raising, right? That art should serve the people. And allow them the critical thinking that was necessary to organize and to create a new society. Here's another photograph of La Barraca. Garcia Lorca is in the front row, the second one from my left. There were many important poets involved in this movement, and it was an important movement. It had its effect in the Spain before the Republic. So I'm going to turn now. I hope I'm not going, I have no idea what time it is. It's like maybe I'm going to, I've taken too much time now, but I will shorten the rest of this. But I wanted to go over a poem written not by Lorca, but by Pablo Neruda about Lorca's generation, because it says so much about what was going on at this time. I'm going to read part of it. Neruda says, and this was right during the war. This was written right around 1937, just after Lorca died. I haven't even mentioned his death yet. I'll do that. He says, you'll ask, where are the lilies and the metaphysics covered with poppies and the rain that often struck his words and filled them with holes and birds? Well, I want to tell you what's happening to me. I used to live in a Madrid neighborhood with bells and clocks and flowers, and from there you could see the entire dry face of Castile like an ocean of leather. My house was called the House of Flowers because everywhere geraniums were exploding. It was a beautiful house. Everywhere there were dogs and children. Do you remember Raúl? Rafael, do you remember? Those are his poets of the same generation. It was Rafael Alberti. And this last one, Federico, under the ground. You're dead. He was killed by then. Do you remember the balconies of my house with the June sun swallowing up flowers in your mouth? Brother, my brother. And he ends this poem. This poem changes from this nostalgic remembrance of the Republic and an abundance. I love this, one of the lines in it that says, it was a Spain with tomatoes that were rolling and rolling until they reached the sea. But all that changed with the bombs, with Franco's bombs. Fire, everything aflame. Much of his neighborhood is now in ruins. There are military people everywhere, aristocrats, priests dressed in funeral black. Those were the people who were causing tremendous devastation in Spain. And Garcia Lorca was one of its victims. What is Neruda's answer to what's happened to your old poetry? You were so, all your words were so beautiful with lilies, and the words were so complex and made us all want to think, what's happened to your poetry now? And Neruda actually got that question. And his answer to that was, come and see the blood in the streets. And he repeats this answer 3 times. Ven a ver la sangre por las calles. And we readers remember that some of that blood was Lorca's, because he, along with so many others in 1936, was a victim of the insurrectionist fascist forces. And how did that happen? And that's another huge question that can be answered in so many different ways. Lorca, how was Lorca killed? Lorca was killed mainly, he was told to flee from Granada to a surrounding town called Biznar. Right there, he was, his friends told the civil guard, they said there's a man, a persona non grata, hiding here. The civil guard went after him and they killed him right there on the spot. And to this day, we have not found his remains. There's one man, one of my favorite historians and literary critics, Ian Gibson, who's still trying to find the remains of Lorca in Granada. But it hasn't been found. And finally, the Spanish government, the new democratic Spanish government, has decided that it was too costly to keep on looking. So it's still a question. Where is Lorca? It's also still a question. Why was he killed? And there are so many varied reasons of them. And one important one, says Ian Gibson, it's because he was a homosexual. And that was something that most people knew, although many of them denied it. And one of Ian Gibson's new works is called Lorca's Gay World. And I'll show you the cover of it. Here's Ian Gibson with Lorca. There he is. There's Gibson in the front. He's Irish, but he's also a Spanish citizen. He speaks Spanish as well as he speaks English with his Irish brogue. And there's Lorca in the background. Ian Gibson was the first one to say to literary critics in the 1980s, Lorca was gay, and that informs his poetry. And I am one of those proponents, because there were many people in the intellectual establishment, including very well-known literary critics of Spain, that said, Lorca, gay? Maybe so, but please don't talk about it. Lorca was way beyond that. Lorca was universal. Why talk about his love life? He was much more important. And Ian Gibson, in his prologue to this book, specifies and pinpoints all of the articles and the polemic that had to do with Lorca's homosexuality. So I go back to one of the concepts that I first mentioned here, and that is historical memory. What is the historical memory of one of the most renowned poets in Spanish life? And Ian Gibson says, we must remember this man as the homosexual that he was. I find this particularly pertinent today because of what's happening in the United States. Who would have? I certainly would not have thought. Back in the 70s, I thought we had gotten beyond those kinds of prejudices, but they're coming back to us in all sorts of really insidious and nasty ways. And Lorca's life is a testament to his struggle against it and to his own victimization. Yes, a victim, but also a great triumph in terms of the contributions that he's made to Spanish culture and Spanish life. Y gracias por la atención. Aquí he terminado.
So thank you so much for the conference. Now we will open the room or the chat for those who join us online. If you have any questions over here, feel free to ask them. And I say into the chat, any questions, this is the moment. Tenemos un thank you so much en el chat de Rosalind. Anything? Here in the room, everything seems very clear. There doesn't seem to be questions either in the chat. So let's close it then. So, oh, there's something. There's a question in the chat. Henry, who played Lorca in the play that we did.
Okay, how do I get it? Henry's question.
It's
There,
in the chat.
click there.
It's in the chat, but I can read it to you. He says,
Okay,
thank you
read
for
it to me.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. When did you first learn of Lorca, and what compelled you to learn more about him?
My father was also a professor of Spanish, although he's had a long story. He started out as a diplomat, but he taught me a great deal about Spanish writers. So from the age of, let's say, 10, I was reading Lorca, and you know, one of the most how should I say that, most remarkable in a positive way aspects of any great poet is that you read this person once at a certain time in your life, and then you read this person again at another time of your life, and what you've just read before, it's no longer, well, it's of interest, but you've added so much to it. So I've taught Lorca, for example. I've had a great deal of great conversations with students studying one of Lorca's major dramatic works and tragedies, La Casa de Bernarda Alba. And I don't know if any of you in the audience have read that work. It's about a very domineering woman. And it's about sexual repression. And not once is homosexuality mentioned in that work, but it's all over the place. All of Bernarda Alba's daughters are sexually frustrated. And it's a kind of love that's prohibited to them. And surely Lorca's description of that, his presentation of that, had to do with his own condition of repressed sexuality.
So in the chat we have Rosalind saying that yes, and there are a few who know La Casa Verde Alba, because in the play we did about Lorca, there is a part in which we represent scenes from the 3 rural dramas that he wrote, like La Casa Bernarda Alba,
Yes.
Yerma, and Bodas de Sangre.
Yes.
So we did little scenes out of those, like the most passionate scene out of those dramas, just to put some of that in the play. So yeah, Rosalind in the chat said that yes, we did read a little bit of La Casa.
Yeah. Hey.
Hi, Rosalind. I can see you.
Thank you. So thanks for the presentation. It was really interesting, and I just want to say that something that you know caught my attention about Lorca is the way how he expressed his feelings, you know, about everything. And we are talking about in like many years ago when homosexuality, sex, and all these kind of things were prohibited. But he was able to express all of these things and feelings, you know, through his poems. And that is something that I really like about Lorca.
I agree with you. Yeah. Do you have a question? Do you want me to respond to your comment?
You want me? You, yeah. I don't have any question, but it was like a comment.
Yeah. No. I can't agree more with that. As a matter of fact, I'm going to tell about my slight disagreement with Ian Gibson, because Ian Gibson's brother was a homosexual. That's what is one of the motivating factors of his new book about Lorca. Um, and so, but Gibson, I think, almost reduces Lorca to almost exclusive homosexuality, and I think you might go too far by that, and express just what you've expressed, Rosalind, and in saying that it's not just homosexuality; it's any kind of desire that one might have, natural desire that's not harmful, that just comes from your body, and it is seen as illicit, as dirty, as something to be ostracized for, something to be punished, some sort of thing that you could land in jail for. And it's certainly, homosexuality was maybe the motivating factor, but I think that we can universalize that experience. And in every one of those three tragedies, Jose Luis, that you're doing, you can see that. From Yerma to Bodas de Sangre, it's all about passion and love and sex. Not explicit sex, but sex is all over the place in that, and it's a part of a dimension of human life.
Thank you for the explanation.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm also here. I just thought it'd be easier to speak than type out my questions. But I enjoyed the presentation very much. I think Jose mentioned it, but I played Lorca in the play.
Great.
It was
what was your role?
It was Lorca, but it was Lorca as a young adult around 20 in college. My scene was with Dali.
Okay, with Dali.
And it was
yeah,
and it was about their relationship in college.
Great.
But I'm just wondering, so I'm an native English speaker, learning Spanish, and I'm currently reading Poeta en Nueva York.
Yeah.
And as recommended by Jose for my first poetry book by Lorca.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, because I'm reading the English mainly, but I can't help but agree with you when you say that the Spanish sounds much, it's much more eloquent. It's obviously, it was written in, and I just wonder, because the Spanish is kind of more advanced, are there any tips that you have maybe for someone who is learning Spanish to kind of grasping the way that Lorca writes in Spanish specifically versus how it's translated in English?
Yeah. I'm going to give you something really specific that has helped me, and it has helped my students. Sometimes I have my students write exercises of translation. They say, okay, this passage is difficult to understand. Try to translate it. And you know what happened? Because I'm a translator. I've translated several works. And there's something that's remarkable that happens when you're trying to translate. And that is, you get beyond the obvious reasons. You have to consider every word in the text. And once you translate word for word, because that's not going to get you anywhere, then you try it with your own creativity, turn it into something meaningful, at least meaningful to you. And maybe that might help you with the Spanish.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, I will definitely try that. I think I've been maybe unnecessarily like timid to jump into the Spanish. I do the reading of the English, and it's a bilingual edition, so I try to do an English reading and then do a Spanish reading and kind of compare the two. And I think that's helped a lot, but there's still areas where I'm like, I get confused, and maybe that is the right approach, to do more of a granular examination of the words,
Right,
rather than trying to take it as a whole.
right. Henry, let me give you a couple of words of encouragement here. There are parts of Poeta en Nueva York that I have no idea what he's getting at. And one of the texts that helped me with that was Ian Gibson's biography of Lorca. Because one of the things that he says is many of those meanings are personal, but only to him. And so because Gibson is as much a historian, and he's such a good researcher, and he's interviewed some of the people whom Lorca knew when they were in New York, sometimes he gives us a passage and he tells us this is what he was referring to. And it's remarkable. It was really enlightening to me. So that's Ian Gibson's biography of Lorca. I recommend highly. There's so much written on him.
Yeah. Okay. I will absolutely. I'm gonna write that down right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I also just want to learn more about Lorca, so I think that would be honestly just a really interesting read, just for that reason as well.
Good.
So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
Any other questions? Anyone? Question? No. Bien, so thank you so much, Miguel, for the conference. It was really, really nice. So I recorded this. Hopefully it will be saved and I will be able to upload it to YouTube. I'm going to stop the